Imagine someone who knows your whole story, the thing that broke you open, the betrayal, the loss, the childhood that shaped you in ways you're still trying to understand. Now imagine they've heard you tell that story so many times that they can finish your sentences, and one day, gently, they ask you something you weren't prepared for. Who are you when you're not telling that story? That question might be the most important one nobody ever taught you to ask yourself. Because somewhere between experiencing something painful and healing from it, a lot of us made a quiet detour. We stopped describing what happened to us, and we became it. Today, I want to talk about what that costs you and what becomes possible when you stop. There's something that happens in healing spaces that nobody talks about honestly enough. You were told, rightly, to name what happened, to stop pretending, to acknowledge the wound instead of carrying it in silence. And that was true. That mattered. But for many people, something happened next that wasn't part of the plan. The story became the self. You started introducing yourself through your pain. Not always out loud, sometimes just internally. I'm anxious. Not, I feel anxious sometimes. I'm broken. Not, I went through something that broke me. I'm damaged, as though damage were a permanent category of being. The verb to be is doing a lot of invisible work in those sentences. It's turning a temporary state into a permanent identity. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying your pain wasn't real. It was. I'm not saying your trauma didn't shape you. It did. What I'm saying is that there is a difference, an important one, between having experienced something and being something. You experienced betrayal. You are not betrayal. You experienced loss. You are not loss. You experienced fear. You are not fear. But the language collapses that distinction. And once the language collapses, the brain follows. Here's what trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk documented across a lifetime of clinical work. The brain doesn't just store memories, it uses them to build an identity system. When you repeatedly tell a story about yourself, especially an emotionally charged one, your brain begins to organize around it. It becomes a prediction machine running on your narrative. What this means practically is this. If your dominant story is, I am someone who was abandoned, your brain will start scanning every relationship for signs of abandonment. A partner who goes quiet becomes proof. A delayed reply becomes confirmation. An ordinary moment of distance becomes evidence of what you always knew. You're not interpreting reality anymore. You're confirming the script. There's a principle in neuroscience that captures this simply. Neurons that fire together wire together. It was first articulated by Canadian neuroscientist Donald Hebb, and it describes one of the most fundamental habits of the human brain. Every time you tell your trauma story, you activate the same neural circuits. Every time you process the memory in the same way, you deepen the groove. And here is something that nobody warns you about. Your nervous system doesn't fully distinguish between remembering something and reliving it. The retelling can become, on a physiological level, a new traumatic event. So the more bandwidth your trauma narrative has, the more you return to it, rehearse it, explain yourself through it, the more your brain treats it as the most important thing to know about you. It becomes the lens, and everything you see starts to look like confirmation. Now, I want to name something that the healing community rarely talks about openly. There are hidden rewards to trauma identity. When you're the person who was damaged, you receive something. You receive exemption. From risk, from accountability, from the terrifying task of authoring your own life. You receive explanation for why things haven't worked out the way you hoped. You receive community, a sense of belonging with others who are also organized around their wound. And sometimes, quietly, you receive a kind of identity that feels more real than anything you could have built yourself. None of this is shameful. It makes sense. The wound happened before you had the tools to process it. You built what you could with what you had. But here's what I want you to sit with. If you are not your trauma, then who are you? And if you can't answer that clearly, the trauma identity will fill the silence. Because it is familiar. Because it is known. Because your nervous system would rather live in a familiar cage than an open field it doesn't recognize. The trap isn't that you're weak. The trap is that you've been very human. So what does it actually look like to stop identifying with your trauma? It doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen. It doesn't mean skipping the grief. It doesn't mean becoming relentlessly positive about pain that was genuinely painful. It means something quieter and more radical than any of that. Trauma therapist Peter Levine developed a practice he called pendulation. The principle is this: you don't stay in the pain, you don't suppress the pain, you move toward it, and then you consciously move back. You bring your attention to the place in your body where the memory lives, and then you bring it back to a place that feels even slightly more okay. A physical sensation of safety, the weight of your feet on the floor, the warmth of sunlight on your skin. You oscillate back and forth until your nervous system begins to learn something it didn't know before, that you can visit the wound and return, that the wound is not all of you. There's another practice that doesn't get the attention it deserves, and it's almost counterintuitive for people who've been in deep trauma work. It's the deliberate, repeated activation of memories where you felt safe, capable, seen, strong. Not to deny the wound, but to build a competing neural pathway alongside it. Because your brain cannot hold two equally powerful identities at the same time. Right now, the trauma identity probably has more bandwidth, more repetition, more emotional charge, more history. But if you built an equally real identity as someone who has also experienced resilience, safety, capability, your brain would have to negotiate between them. And something shifts when it does. You stop being a character in the trauma story, and you start becoming the author of a more complex one. There's one more thing that nobody tells you when you start this work. You have to grieve the identity you're leaving behind. Even when it was painful, it was yours. It explained things. It gave you a framework for understanding why life looked the way it did. It connected you to people who loved you inside that story. Letting it go means facing something uncomfortable, that you don't have that explanation anymore, that you'll have to build something new, not from what happened to you, but from what you choose now. And that is genuinely frightening, because it means you're responsible for what comes next. Viktor Frankl, who survived what most of us cannot imagine, wrote that the last of human freedoms is the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Not to deny the circumstances, not to pretend the suffering wasn't real, but to refuse to let the suffering write the final sentence about who you are. That's not a small thing. It's perhaps the largest thing. Your trauma was real. What was done to you, or taken from you, or left undone when you needed it most, that was real. And you are more than the sum of what happened to you. The story that explains your pain is not the story of who you are. It's one chapter, perhaps an important one, but not the whole book. And somewhere inside you, there is a version of yourself that exists before the wound and beyond it, that doesn't need the story to feel real. The question I'll leave you with today is a simple one. Who would you be if the wound wasn't the most important thing about you? You don't have to answer that right now. But I think it's worth asking. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you're new here, this is what we do on this channel. We ask the questions that nobody thought to teach us. I'll see you in the next one.